Hi, this is Steve Hargadon. It's the 7th of September. This is the Hack Education podcast, weekly podcast with Audrey Waters. Hi, Audrey.
Hi, Steve.
It seems like we just spoke. We did just
I think
speak.
We did. Well, we recorded a podcast Monday, and then we were on a webinar that yesterday.
That's right. Lots of together time this week, virtual together. So your first story is Smarter Cookie. And I'm wondering if I actually spoke to someone from Smarter Cookie because there was so much of this that was familiar. So I've known about it, and I've really wondered about how teachers will react to it. Would you like to describe what the story is?
So the startup was founded by a former TSA alum who had this experience when she was teaching in the classroom that she wanted more feedback. She felt that she needed more feedback, and she and her roommate have devised a system called Smarter Cookie that allows teachers to videotape a lesson and then share it with a select group of people. You could share it with your mentors or other teachers other teachers in your building, and get feedback on your lesson. And it's actually time-stamped feedback so that you can point to a specific place in the video and say, I like how you handled that response. Consider trying X, Y, or Z. So it's meant to be sort of a way for teachers to help other teachers get feedback in the classroom.
So I have a really hard time imagining most teachers being comfortable with the idea of videotaping themselves and then presenting that to others and exposing themselves sort of voluntarily to that kind of feedback. Is that too cynical?
I think about this, myself. I think about the times in which I've had classroom observed, and I think that anything that feels like observation and at times I think surveillance can be intimidating. But I don't know if it's necessarily the case that folks would feel uncomfortable with that. And I think that we're actually seeing people use video more and more, feel more comfortable being on video, sharing video. And so I don't know if sort of culturally we're more comfortable with being recorded. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm certain that it would be valuable, right? And and by virtue of their describing sort of the privacy policy, you can tell that one of the first concerns would be, is this going to come back to bite me? Right? Mm-hmm. Is this going to be shown somewhere or the like? But I even have trouble watching recordings of myself. Right? I mean, I know I would be a better speaker if I would do so, but I have a sort of an inherent barrier to this. So then I thought, well, maybe if you were in a school or in a district or a group of schools where this was part of the professional development process, and you were kind of coached, and this was part of a larger team building exercise or an exercise by a team, that would feel more comfortable. And I was intrigued sort of at that thought. But then I also thought that also has sort of some inherent dangers as well, which is, are you really in a situation where you're, how nuanced would the program have to be to really have this be empowering rather than sort of critical?
Yeah, no, I think that there are a lot of questions just that sort around this. I mean, I think that other questions about how does videotaping your class change the way in which students act? So I think that there are so many questions around stuff, and I do think it's a really interesting idea. And from what I understand, I'm also heard from some other teachers that they're actually trying this on their own, not as a startup, but this idea of videotaping and sharing each other's lessons and getting feedback from one another. A group of physics teachers told me that they do that.
So that seems really sensible and smart. Again, sort of where does the revenue model play into this? Revenue will probably favor larger implementations by organizations that are more likely to be sort of top-down controlling. Again, I don't want to sound cynical, but do they have a revenue plan?
No, and I think that this is certainly an example of a company that I'm not sure there's a business here. Although I think it's a great idea, but I don't know if this is something that you can build a business around. Maybe it's one piece of a larger business, but it certainly feels, as it stands, like I just said, other teachers are sort of already doing this on their own. I'm not sure what's really here to sort of have a viable startup on.
So not like I'm any kind of an expert, but it seems like some kind of a training program that would be sort of more participative, that larger institutions or districts would purchase, where there was training in the use of video and how to do this with this as the back end support.
Right.
Would sound to me maybe like a potentially good product.
Yeah. I just think sort of as this first iteration, and I should say that this company, just opened up their doors, went live this week. So they're very early. I think they recognize that too. Sort of as they move forward and figuring out sort of where to take this next.
So we'll come back, I think, to this question of products that are specifically designed for the ed market. Your next story is about the most anticipated back-to-school tech tools. Some surprises there?
Yeah, this is. I've done this for the last couple of years, and it's interesting to me, albeit sort of very far from a scientific survey. It's very interesting to me to see, to look at people's responses and to see how they've changed. So the top three this year, one wasn't a surprise. One was the iPad. It's been on the list sort of every year I've asked this question. The other one was Google Plus, which I thought was an interesting choice, and not the social network I would have thought I wouldn't have thought that was people's first choice. But the most popular response was Instructure Canvas, the LMS startup. And I thought, well, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that the technology they were most excited about using it for back to school was their LMS. So kudos to Instructure, and it looks like I think they're getting a lot of new clients that are looking forward to that. So that was a surprise for me.
Well, both the Google Plus and the Instructure Canvas, you wondered if the results were skewed, right?
Yeah.
But even skewed, they're still interesting. And Google Plus could be because people on Google Plus responded. You don't know if Instructure Canvas kind of put the word out to respond. But either way, it's still very interesting. I would not have picked Google Plus. That surprised me.
Well, and a lot of people picked Google products as well, which was this other, and another piece of it is that iPad certainly has a lot of the mind share when we think about hardware, when we think about apps. But Google was actually by far the most popular choice if you looked at the variety of Google products that people mentioned. So Google Plus, a lot of people talked about specifically about Google Hangouts, which we use this week. I think it's a great platform. Google Apps for Education, the new Nexus tablet. So lots of excitement for Google, lots of interest in the iPad. Thinking about how those companies, Google and Apple, are marketing to educators. It's sort of an interesting thing to look at which of their products are popular.
Intriguingly, though, Google's relationship with education has much less to do with money than Apple's.
Yeah, I think that Google makes its money elsewhere. So it is interesting. I think it's interesting to see the iPad, the amount of people sort of shelling out money for iPads, definitely a huge part of Apple's market right now. Interestingly, too, no one mentioned Chromebooks.
Yeah, and I have to say, you sent me a Chrome box from your time at Google, and I have loved it. I actually really like it.
Yeah, I like the. I think it's. I mean, it's just that I think it's back to sort of the mind share of people. I thought it was really interesting that it was, it was the iPad. It wasn't any other Apple products that were mentioned.
In general, though, a level of excitement around EdTech.
Yeah, and I think that was one of my other takeaways, is that there was a wide range of responses. I mean, lots of things that were just mentioned one time by folks, and so definitely lots of different things that people. A good reminder that people are using all sorts of different tools. People are excited about all sorts of different tools. It isn't just these sort of big companies that we hear about in the news all the time. There's, people are using a lot of different things,
including 3D printers and maker type equipment.
Yeah, I think if I had a 3D printer, it would be the thing I was most excited about for back to school as well. So.
Interesting. Okay, EdTech Startup 101. We'll combine two stories into one. Your first post is about this thing called the EdTech Startup Space.
Yeah, so this is the open online class that's being offered out of BYU by David Wiley. This week we turned to look at the EdTech Startup Space, and that was the phrasing in the assignments, and sort of asked to consider some of the startups in the space. And I wrote a post asking some questions about that word space. It's a term that I think it's sort of hard to figure out what we mean by space. It seems like one of those almost like corporate jargon words, where we don't want to talk about industry and we don't want to talk about markets. And the EdTech startup space doesn't seem to really be a discussion about teaching and learning, but it seems to be a discussion about industry and markets. So my first post was just thinking about that word space and why do we use, what are we sort of not paying attention to when we sort of erase the clear sort of market forces and talk about the sort of generalized space.
The first thing that occurred to me was that if it's a space, then someone can own it. We put those words together in the English language, right? Someone owns the space. And that was the first sort of kind of surprise response I had to this idea of thinking of it as a space.
I also was thinking about it as not I think about the difference between a space and a place. And I think if you think about education as a place, we think of, clearly brick and mortar schools, libraries, the things that are associated with the places in which we learn, museums, and our interactions to the objects there. And then the space, is a space placeless? I don't know. And so thinking about, what does the move to online, more and more online resources do for education places? And so it's an interesting way of framing and phrasing things that I don't think actually people necessarily pick apart.
I was afraid last week that I sounded overly critical of BYU. I need to make it clear I've had a daughter who went through BYU. She's the theater major who now teaches theater to children with drama. And I have a daughter who's a freshman at BYU. So my remarks were not intended to be critical of BYU, but just sort of questioning of sort of the overall process. Can you tell me what's the connection between the painful correspondence you had with an EdTech entrepreneur and this story?
This was a post that I wrote, or I responded to. Gosh, it's been about a year ago. An entrepreneur had created a product, that really didn't solve a problem. It didn't. In fact, my thought was that it actually sort of created more work for teachers. It was a data dashboard that teachers were supposed to use to sort of give them sort of visual cues about what was happening in their classroom. And the person sort of pumped a lot of his own money into it. The startup went nowhere. He wrote a very angry post when he decided to, close up shop, that blaming teachers for not being tech savvy and not adopting his tool. And so I think that I wrote a response back to that. It sort of quickly devolved into a sort of an more angry blog post. And it was just thinking about sort of the space that is, again, back to space, that is really and oftentimes a very hostile place for sort of bridging the gaps between what educators want and what entrepreneurs are trying to sell them.
I'm actually surprised that you and I haven't, maybe you have, but I haven't been getting any kind of sort of overtly critical responses to the ways in which we've been kind of honest in our assessments of these different projects.
I get lots of angry comments on my blog. Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah, well, I've been avoiding those.
There are certain blog posts that I do not read the comments. So yeah.
Just like I don't watch I don't dare watch that digital media and learning interview yesterday, because I know I'll see all the things I don't want to see. So you avoid the blog comments.
Right. Screw feedback. Who needs feedback, right?
Okay, so the second story on the same Ed Startup 101 was you cheated a little. So tell us about why you were cheating and how you did.
The actual assignment for week 2 was to look at a list of 9 startups that the organizers of the class said that they loved, and the assignment was to sort of tell us your thoughts about these startups. And there was an interesting collection of startups, and I didn't really feel, particularly since I get so many wonderfully angry comments for a post that I wrote about one of them on that list in particular, I didn't feel like it was going to be worth my time to write a story about critiquing, I think, in many cases, that group of 9. So I went back to a happier post that I wrote at the end of last year with my choice for my favorite startups that were founded in 2011. And I revisited my arguments for why I liked those startups, and I also went and asked the various founders what they've been up to since December, to sort of update their status. I think it is. I mean, it's something I've failed to do as a writer. Sort of, when you cover a particular company, you would often fail to sort of circle back around and check in and ask questions later and see if sort of all the promise, the marketing promise, and the shine on the new product, if that actually is still sort of interesting or successful after a little bit of time.
So aside from the fact that just about everybody says there's a new thing coming out soon, were there other general impressions that you got from this exercise?
Actually, one of the things that looking back at this, I was really pleased with the companies that I chose. I think that I feel good about those companies, what they've been doing. It's good to see them all moving forward. Some of them, at different speeds than others. There are different levels of funding, different ability. I mean, some of them I think are still unfunded. But it was an interesting process to go back and to ask folks how things had changed, and to look at the list and nod my head and say, yeah, this is a good group of startups.
Well, it was interesting to me to read through the list, because you do say that you love some of them, right? I mean, you're open about liking them, but you give some reasons for it. I mean, you'll identify that there's a particular reason why this is a project or a company that you admire or like what they're doing. Was it kind of weird that there was that there were stated for the assignment that there were these companies that startups we love? That was surprising, that phrasing, to me.
It was surprising to me as well, and without any explanation about why. And it wasn't framed as though these are startups that are interesting, or these are startups that are, tackling a variety of different problems in education. But it was framed as startups we loved. I thought was I think it was why I opted to return to this post about startups that I like, rather than respond to a list that the professors had sanctioned.
In general, was there anything that stood out to you with regard to the funding of the companies that you had looked at?
Some of the companies have received funding this year. I think that it was interesting thinking. That's actually a really good question, because in this week's roundup of news, there's a lot of really substantial rounds of funding raised. I mean, $80 million is sort of an anomaly, but in the $5 and $7 million range. And looking back through at the 10 that I have chosen, I don't think any of them have raised money in that to that level. So maybe I guess investors just aren't following me, huh?
Well, there may be another reason for that pattern. What about revenue? Any lessons there from those companies about revenue patterns or plans?
I think that some of these companies are still definitely very much thinking through this. Some of them have a clearer path to that than others. I think Launchpad Toys is a great example of a company that I think has really sort of figured out a good way to make money selling educational apps, with a free app, and then sort of charging people a small amount of money for sort of bonus add-on pieces. Raspberry Pi and Littlebits, those are hardware companies, so they actually have a thing that you buy. They have so they have revenue. The others are still, I think, looking through the list, I think a lot of them have different partnership deals that they've made in order to have revenue.
Interesting. Raspberry Pi is interesting because it's not really an educational product, but my guess is it's very popular in education.
Well, I think that is their. It was designed, I think, to be an educational product, and this is a nonprofit as well. This is the only one on the list that's a nonprofit, which is really important to remember, that you can be a startup, a nonprofit, but you don't actually have to be a for-profit startup.
I might almost argue that Raspberry Pi is intended as a learning product, but not necessarily as an education product.
Interesting. Okay. Well, then I would say the same about Littlebits too.
Yeah, I guess it depends on are you actively marketing to schools, and are schools your primary focus of your marketing? Yeah. Interesting. I still have this sense that there's a lesson to be learned from creating products that aren't specifically just for education, and that where we've seen some real success, a lot of the products I use for my own personal learning were built for learning, but weren't built for the education market.
Right. Yeah. The education space.
The education space. Oh, I can't wait till we get to your news speeches, because you're finally getting some snarkiness back in the news stories. Okay, so you did your own aggregation, a story of aggregation without attribution, and this was really interesting to me. Right, you and I have talked about ethics here. Yeah,
this is some bad behavior from that's been going on for quite some time, and that I haven't ever sort of spoken about publicly, because I think that there are opportunities for you to sort of resolve things privately before using, using a public platform like I have, my blog, and Twitter, for example, to sort of get things taken care of. My blog, along with many, many, many other education blogs, was being repurposed by the Gilfis Education Group, which is a consulting company founded run by the co-founder of Blackboard, who was using our posts without attribution, certainly without permission, without any links back to the original source. And I think many people had asked them to stop. And finally, the people turned to Twitter, people started blogging about it, and lo and behold, within that day, all of our posts were taken down.
Well, that was a technology error, right? I mean, that wasn't them actually, doing anything. That was some kind of a problem they had, right? That
is the justification that they gave, but I think that it is hard to believe that's the case.
What was really galling to me here was, we all have I've put RSS feeds on wikis dozens to hundreds of times, to aggregate or collect information around a particular topic, or, you can do this with Digo, right? So you're watching different bloggers and you have a way of aggregating those posts from those bloggers. But that's always within the context of the authorship being clear, right? You choose to put your posts, you choose to have an RSS feed for your posts. What was galling here was that it actually looked like they were posted, which was code word for written, by somebody else.
Right. And I openly license my material. The material on my blog is Creative Commons licensed, with two stipulations: that I have to be attributed, so that you have to note that it comes from me, and that it's share alike. So you can't actually slap a copyright symbol. You must, if you're going to use my work, reuse my work, which you're free to do, you must use the same license. And I think for me, this is a huge issue. It was, the irony, of course, is that I'm working on all of this open content research. I was about to write a post this week on some of the confusions around licensing and issues I think that people struggle with licensing. And then to sort of have my work sort of blatantly listed this way it's really frustrating when your work gets stolen.
That was one of the ironies. The other sort of delicious irony was that their feed actually picked up a story that was criticizing their practice.
Yes. And the other thing I had to laugh about is, it's sort of interesting, the interesting group of people that they were choosing to post their blogs were people who I think are actually quite critical of sort of a lot of the mainstream education goings on. So, I think it's funny to think of, if you opt to sort of pilfer the posts of Stephen Downes and Audrey Waters and Brian Lamb and Alan Levine, it's an interesting set of characters that you're choosing to sort of build the credibility of your consulting firm around. So that's funny.
I know this isn't the only ethical issue you're kind of wanting to talk about. Do we dare go into this question of people who are representing companies or getting paid by companies as bloggers who are not representing that they are getting paid?
Yeah, I haven't really done much more about that since we talked about it. I guess we'll say for now it's a good reminder that disclosure, attribution is attribution is one key thing when you're writing online. Sort of the requirements, both sort of community requirements, legal requirements, ethical requirements to cite your sources to link back. But the other reminder is that if you are taking money as a blogger, that you do need to fully disclose that relationship, or if you receive products free products from a company that you're supposed to disclose things. So I think maybe we should leave it at that.
You're sending me a Chromebox. I don't think I ever disclosed that on my blog. Am I in trouble?
Have you blogged about how much you love Google? I think you're fine.
I actually do love Google, and you did gift me a Chromebox, and I have, I do.
Which I should, and now I get to disclose that I got for free from Google for attending Google I/O. So full disclosure.
Well, let's just spend the next half hour disclosing things. I hope I'm not open to criticism in this area. I mean, I do consulting work. I have worked for several companies. I always try and disclose that early on in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it's sometimes, I don't know this, I have a sense that it's sometimes awkward for my clients that I do that so quickly and so frequently. But I feel like it's really important for people to know what they're getting when I'm talking about something where I'm getting paid.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important, and I think that, for me too, it's better to err on the side of sort of disclosing too much and then to not be transparent, particularly when it comes to financial things. I mean, and I think it's one of the things that I think about that, I think about even that list of the startups that I love. I mean, I think about the there's a certain amount of transparency that I have to say there. Like I really, some of those startups I really do think they're great. I've never taken any money from them, but I certainly have reached the point now where I've talked so many times and that I consider them my friends as well. And I think that it does get really tricky to sort of, fully disclose when you have a relationship, financial or emotional or otherwise. I think it's hard, but to be as open and honest as possible.
So there's a bigger story here. I don't mean for us to dive too deeply, but clearly financial relationships entangle us, mm-hmm. and they can also change our motivations.
Right.
And even if not our motivations, they can change the amount of time we spend on things. So this is where things have gotten really tricky in some of the cases where large companies were providing perks and benefits or trips and the like to decision makers in education. And clearly mm-hmm. that's the bigger version of what we're talking about.
Right.
Is it really good for learning, or is it because there's a financial relationship that benefits the decision maker?
Yeah.
Okay, so your next post is called Elsewhere. Elsewhere. I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that, but you were on 2 different Google Hangouts.
Yes, one with you.
I couldn't get past the squawking first 3 minutes of your second to actually listen to it. And that's probably not fair, but I wasn't even really that interested. But so tell me about the second one. Was there more value to it than I, with less thoughtfulness than I should have dismissed it?
No, that's funny. Yeah, I think that there were some audio issues. I probably should have warned people. I'd forgotten that it had gone live while there were still audio problems. That was called an EdTech Fireside Chat, and it was organized by New School Ventures Fund, which is a venture fund that focuses on education, funding education companies, and a couple of other entrepreneurs. One of the co-founders of EdSurge, just talking about sort of the EdTech startup space, if you will, and it was such a different conversation about the future of education than the webinar that you and I participated in yesterday. It was really striking to me. Certainly the one was focused very much so on industry, money, opportunity. The other talking about sort of learner agency. It was, considering that the topics were sort of closely aligned, the actual conversations were so divergent.
Any personal takeaways?
I think it's For me, I mean, it was funny thinking about what you just said with not wanting to watch yourself on video. But it's interesting for me to think about sort of where I'm comfortable, and I'm certainly much more comfortable, even though I spend a lot of time talking about startups, I'm certainly much more comfortable talking about learning than I am talking about how to make money on your business. Those were my takeaways from watching myself on these videos.
My personal takeaway was that I want a treadmill like Brian Alexander's, so
yes.
that when I'm online, I can be exercising.
Yes, my new apartment, I'm using a standing desk, so not quite a treadmill.
Okay, so let's move to your news stories.
Yes.
And okay, so you and I think, had very similar responses to the two conventions, the Republican and Democratic conventions, as they related to education.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was, there was, it seemed very, I mean, like I say in my wrap-up post, lots of rhetoric, very little substance, and even the rhetoric that I heard in both cases seemed so disconnected from the sorts of change that I would like to see. And I felt the one interesting piece for me was that there was no mention of race to the top, which is sort of Obama's signature education policy. Instead, there was just a lot of talk about educating other people, increasing student achievement, but that policy piece was missing.
I interviewed Ron Walk this week, an interview I really enjoyed on this book called Wasting Minds. And I asked him, I said, is there anybody speaking in the public political sphere who's saying things that you find are thoughtful and accurate about education? And he could not think of a single person. And I'm struggling with this too. I'm intrigued at how there doesn't seem to be representation of a deeper thinking about education than competition and achievement. Yeah, I mean, and competition framed in a way that the sort of nationalistic, jingoistic sort of fear of China competition, which feels really troubling in a global world, that it's framed that way as well. So California passed an open textbook bill? Yes, headed to the governor's desk. So this bill, if passed, somewhat similar to an initiative in Washington State, which is to create a repository of textbooks for some of the most popular, commonly offered classes at the California State public universities. So this is a great move in terms of giving students and professors options for some affordable textbooks. I think we're going to look back and really appreciate Cable Green, because I think cable's been at the heart of a number of these movements. Back and forth on Virginia's NCLB waiver. I think I read this week that the percentage of funding for most schools that comes from the national government doesn't exceed 7%. And I keep having this imagery of the tail wagging the dog. Yeah. Is that fair? No, I think that that's a really good question. It does feel as though, I think that particularly seeing the way in which, although there's not funding, how that funding and certainly the threat of punitive measures, schools being closed down, teachers losing their jobs, takeover of schools. It certainly does feel as though the demands for No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top are certainly having schools respond at levels that do seem to far outweigh the sort of amount of funding that the federal government gives to school system. And you've added two sort of new categories to your news. There's the Are You Friggin' Serious department and the I'm Not Making This Up department. So the country could save $10 billion a year by cutting staff levels for special education. And
yeah. But to me, I mean, I recognize that there are probably a lot of areas in which the schools are, the bureaucracy of the school system is grossly inefficient. There are lots of places where we could take a good look at the budget and probably trim plenty of things. And in some cases, those are probably staff positions. But the argument that we're going to save money by cutting special education staff just seems to me to be looking at a place that wouldn't have made my list of targets for budget cuts.
Well, that surprises me because we've been so successful with cutting mental health programs.
Right. Oh, yeah. Depressing.
Okay, and then the Not Making It Up department story is about the Libyan Investment Authority's small, but probably quite a lot of actual dollars, investment in Pearson.
Yes, Pearson, the largest education company in the world. 3% of the company, the British authorities froze the assets this week of the Libyan Investment Authority, which owns 3% of the stake in Pearson. The government is sort of trying to crack down on assets of Muammar Gaddafi and his family. And so there you go. Gaddafi owns 3% of Pearson. So,
I don't know whether that's significant or if it's sort of making a mountain out of a molehill. My guess is that, the way the investment funds are handled goes through, dealers and brokers and all kinds of consulting organizations. Is the story worth pursuing, or is it just a case of, Gaddafi had a lot of money and this is where some of it went?
And textbooks and standardized testing are a good investment.
Interesting. Okay, I want to move to Estonia.
Yeah, this is interesting. So Estonia, which has some of the fastest internet in the world. Estonia is where Skype came out of. A nonprofit there is devising a curriculum, and the plans are to teach computer programming to all public school students in Estonia, beginning in grade 1. So it's a real commitment on the part of the government to teach computer science.
Why is it I have such a hard time imagining our political process producing anything close to that kind of a commitment?
It is interesting. I mean, it is interesting to think about. I mean, particularly I think people talk a lot about high-paying, high-skilled jobs, the importance of STEM. And it is interesting that we really don't see computer science as a priority. I mean, it was a priority in the curriculum anywhere. I mean, I think still very, very few schools teach computer science at K through 12 level.
So now that you and I both sent our original Kindles back to Amazon, are we going to take a leap again? Have they produced anything that made you want to rethink buying an Amazon Kindle?
For me, I think I wonder in some ways that I'm not a real gadget heavy person. I have my iPhone, which I love, a smartphone, and I have my laptop, which I love, and I don't feel like I'm missing a lot of devices in my life. I don't feel the need for a tablet. I don't necessarily feel the need for a Kindle Fire, which is sort of a e-reader, movie-watching device. That being said, I think that I do think that Amazon probably has several winning things on here. They're covering a wide range of products at a wide range of prices, and I think that they're in a strong position to compete with Apple.
I was kind of intrigued by the $49 year-long 4G LTE wireless contract. Certainly, watching movies sucks a lot of bandwidth.
Yeah.
And my guess is that it's probably not hard to hack this to have it become a hotspot.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so all of a sudden you have 4G access for $50 a year. That would be pretty amazing.
The other piece that came to my attention was that they're actually rolling out something that will sync both audio books and the printed book. So if you are listening to an audio version, the next time you open your Kindle to the printed version, it'll remember where you left off. And that's like a minor technical detail that a bibliophile would care deeply about, but I think that's actually really cool. So I
don't think that's a minor technical detail at all. I switched phones, and so all of my Audible books, right? I had to install Audible on my new phone, and then I had to download all of the books again, and it lost the place I was in all of those books. I didn't realize that was going to happen.
Oh, yikes, yeah.
Or that it would have such an impact on me trying to figure out where I was again.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so sure I care that much. I actually kind of like the idea of syncing the audio version with the physical book.
Mm-hmm.
But I often make a choice between if I buy the physical book or am I going to buy the audio book.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do love it that I can read from my Kindle software on any device and it remembers where I was.
Yeah.
So interesting. Okay, so moving on. What animal is on the JavaScript book that makes you want to
rhinoceros.
Oh, the rhinoceros. I did a Google image search, and there's an owl on one, and there's so is the rhinoceros your favorite animal?
No, it's not my favorite animal, but it's funny because I've been looking forward to the O'Reilly Media books coming out on Inkling for a long time. So sort of the blend of the Inkling technology with, I think, what remains a very well-loved series of books by people who are learning particular programming languages. And I've been sort of trying to learn to program, going back and forth between Python, which I really adore in terms of sort of it makes a lot of sense to me, and JavaScript, which I find I use more, but is harder. I'm having a harder time wrapping my brain around. But I'm definitely afraid of snakes, so I'm not going to do the Python book. I'm going to go with the Rhino.
So I'm interested in where you would be using JavaScript or Python.
I think for Python, I'm not. JavaScript, I think I try to work a little bit on my website and building out things on my own site, and so JavaScript is something that makes it's something that sort of I'm already sort of thinking about moving towards jQuery and things like that. So. Wow,
you are a hacker.
Or I play one on the internet.
Yeah. World Reader announced more partnerships with major publishers for their ebook libraries via Kindles to Children in Africa.
Yeah, we've talked about this group a lot. This is a nonprofit that I really like, and they've signed on quite a few major publishers, as well as some African publishers as well, in the hopes of sort of expanding the library that when you give someone a Kindle now, that you have a really great body of books that you have access to on it.
This is a story we've continued to follow and I'm really interested in. It's sort of this story of, will this kind of a program make more of a difference than, say, the one laptop per child program, which was obviously much more sophisticated and complicated. And this seems like it's, relatively straightforward. Has there been any news that you've read about Nicholas Negroponte's sort of next step with one laptop per child, which was the tablet device?
I keep hearing. I subscribe to the One Laptop per Child blog, and they often talk about specs, specs and devices that are coming soon. But I haven't yet seen any plans for putting for releasing the tablet into the wild.
Interesting.
And I
I
think
thought
that
they were
that's
going to
something
drop
that
them from helicopters.
well, and I think that it's something that, one laptop per child has been plagued with almost since the beginning, sort of this real difficulty in actually manufacturing as for the price, at a low price point, devices that are low energy and highly durable.
What happened with the School of One's math software?
It doesn't work. Shocker. So this School of One was, it's been several years now, but this was really one of these pieces of software that was touted a couple of years ago as being something that was going to revolutionize math education. It was a favorite of then Chancellor of the New York City Schools, Joel Klein. Several pilot programs. The Department of Education dumped a lot of money into this the software, which was actually created by a former Department of Education employee. And now the results of the pilot study are in, and it doesn't seem to do any better, despite all the promise of sort of personalized, individualized math instruction. It's no better than a human teacher. So several of the schools are actually leaving the pilot program.
Interesting. I probably sound like a broken record, but I really am waiting for this ed tech bubble to burst. All of this money, and I don't want to presume that every project is going to end up finding out that they're not able to accomplish what they were promising. But this does feel a little bit like a harbinger.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that School of One is just one of many of these tools that are, promise adaptive learning, that say that because students can move at their own pace and that the instruction is personalized, that they are a superior way for kids to learn. And I'm not convinced by the marketing promise, and I do think that we probably are going to see lots of other similar realizations that the sort of promises of being, cutting edge technology aren't actually going to live up to much.
So there's some controversy about what happened at at Harvard. The undergraduate history class has been busted for cheating. That did make me think of Ryerson, right? The famous Facebook Dungeons group, whatever that was. So now the students are insisting that collaboration was supposed to be allowed on this exam?
Yeah, it's been interesting fallout to watch. So this is a take-home exam where I think half of a class was found to have cheated on the final. The students say that they had been allowed to collaborate and work together, and they didn't see that as cheating. And in fact, I think there's been quite a bit of pushback from other pundits, including Slate. There was an article in Slate about, why do we insist on having students work alone on these sorts of things when there aren't circumstances as an adult where you can't talk to another person, that you can't ask for advice or feedback or help or work together. So it's sort of interesting thinking about the ways in which assessment is it's sort of not based on sort of the reality of sort of the grown-up world.
In this particular case, is that the question, whether or not assessments should be individual, or was there confusion about whether or not on this particular exam collaboration was allowed?
I think there was some confusion as to whether or not collaboration was allowed. It sounds like some of the grad students, some of the TAs for the class had said it was okay. They'd encouraged it in the past, and so the students are saying that because several students now are, won't graduate. The repercussions sound pretty severe, and certainly failing a class is never good news. So the students are pushing back, saying, "Wait a minute, I wasn't cheating, and we've been able to work together throughout the whole term."
Interesting. I wonder if the Ryerson comparison is accurate. I wonder if this will be a sort of a learning moment.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so desire to learn, this huge amount of money, $80 million.
Yeah, this is a really interesting story, and I've been sort of stewing on what to make of it. This company, Desire to Learn, has been around for quite some time. I think they're six-year-old company, and they've been bootstrapped up till now. This is their very first round of venture capital, and $80 million makes it the largest round of seed funding for a company in Canadian history. This is big bucks for a seed funding. But thinking about that amount of money in terms of the landscape of learning management systems, sort of interesting to think about what exactly is going on here. What would make Desire to Learn companies already profitable already with revenue? What would make them decide to take on that much cash? Why now?
I don't know enough about this world to give any insight there. I'd be curious to know in the scope of sales of learning management systems where Desire to Learn is, and how they are they working on sort of a cloud-based Schoology and structure model in such a way that they're going to become competitive there.
They say their press release and touted them as cloud-based, but from my understanding that they still, they might have their latest offering might be cloud-based, but I do think that they still have different versions that are installed locally. So I don't know if they are of the same sort of cloud-based ilk that I would think of when we talk about a tool like Instructure.
Interesting. You're kind to make note that my Hack Education tour starts next week. Hack Your Education tour.
Yes.
Not to be confused with Hack Education, because of course they're so embarrassingly close to domain names. But it is hackyoureducation.com, and this came after something of an epiphany, and that was related to the Republican and Democratic conventions, to the interview with Ron Walk, and in the interview with Ron Walk, he had said that they had this idea for an alternative school system. They were really looking for somebody of some public stature who could make a phone call to the White House where the phone call would get picked up, and there would be an ability to convince the White House of this new school system. And I had this moment, this realization that the name that was used was Colin Powell. They were kind of hoping they could get Colin Powell to do this. I had this realization that even were Colin Powell to call the White House, you would still have significant disagreement amongst policymakers as to what education should be for.
Yeah.
And kind of a stunning revelation that I don't actually care about the conversation at that level anymore.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited for your tour. I'm hoping that there'll be several of the dates where I can fly out and we can record our podcast live. Because I thought when we did that in Vegas, it was really interesting to have an audience to ask questions, to give feedback, and to sort of think about. We record it virtually most of the time, so we aren't even sort of sitting in the same room having these conversations. So how do we extend these conversations that you and I have every Friday, and bring it in front of a group of people, and then move those conversations around the country and start having some of these conversations about what is the purpose of education? What's deeply wrong with the system as it stands, and how can we empower learners to sort of take back the reins of their own learning, rather than necessarily, fine-tune the dials on the system. Sort of, what can we do to help improve each other, help improve our community's ability to do what matters to them.
So after that digital media and learning interview, of course, I felt much more articulate afterwards. But Jeff Brazil and I stayed on in the Hangout. And we were talking about sort of cycles of history. I bought a book this last week from Amazon Used called The Self-Directed Learner. It's brilliant. It's from 1975.
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody mention it, right? But so he was talking about how in his he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. In his journalism work, how there would be, he sort of looked through history, and there were these cycles, and this great period of time in the 1850s when there were these conversations about power and media, same conversations that sort of surface every few decades. And we were talking about how that's true in education. And if that's true, that there are these conversations in every generation, then the takeaway for me is that the power is in the conversation.
Yeah.
We're not going to invent something new. Now, the internet holds some very interesting promise, about enhancing learning and ways we think about learning. But the core issues are issues that have been grappled with by humanity for millennia. And if we're not going to all agree, there's no way everybody's going to agree about what education should be. There's going to be differences. Then it seems to me the power is in the conversation. And my goal would be to bring that power to the people who least feel that they have any power right now in education. To help them own the conversation for themselves and to not believe that somebody else dictates what teaching and learning are about for them.
Yeah, no, I think that this tour is going to be, I think it's going to be really exciting to see what comes of this. So you're kicking it off Friday, right? Well,
so the first event will be in Redwood City on Wednesday night, the 12th.
Right.
Purposely timed to follow the departure of the Department of Ed's school bus tour. I can't remember what that's called, because you and I have been following that so closely. But that's
school bus tour.
That's right, the back to school bus tour. So that starts at Sequoia High School that Wednesday in a session that I signed up for. I think it's from 9 to 10:30 or something. But my guess is that will not be a highly interactive event, that it will be very political, and it's not likely to actually impact those who were dispossessed. So the goal was to have a counterpoint kind of event, nothing belligerent, but just to kind of take advantage of that moment to try and do something different. And so it looks like it's going to be held in Redwood Shores at the San Mateo County Office of Education. And the goal is to try and find ways to bring people there who will go through sort of a hands-on few hours of dialogue around kind of taking back ownership of learning for you, your children, and your family.
I think it's great.
Let's hope so. It's kind of a crazy idea. So finally, Colorado State University's global campus is going to accept transfer credit for online education startup Udacity or Udacity CS101.
Yeah, I think, here we go. People have said that the proof will be once accredited universities start accepting Udacity and Coursera edX classes for credit. Then we really, we aren't going to see much change until that happens. And here we go. It's happening.
So what changes that people hope to see?
Well, I think that it's, can these open online courses provide an alternative to the very expensive cost of tuition, right? Can you piece together your own learning and then get official credit from it? Should you just decide to, pursue a degree from the university? Can you get a degree by piecing together free classes from a MOOC?
I'm really intrigued by this. I'm all for piecing together, getting credit, and the like. I'm intrigued by universities' responses. I have this image of the university sitting out on the end of a diving board or a piece of plywood and sawing away the very thing that supports them, which would be the personal experience, the local experience, the in fact, individual aspects of education that just aren't a part of this redefined MOOC.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is worth pointing out here that this particular CSU campus is already an online school, so this isn't taking away the experience of the experience that you'd have on campus in Fort Collins. This is already an online version of that. But I think that the point's well taken, and I do think universities will need to start thinking about how do you sell to students that they want to come to your campus and have an experience there.
I know University of Phoenix has a lot of baggage associated with it. I interviewed Angie McAllister last night, who is responsible for a lot of the sort of brilliant work they're doing on trying to figure out learning analytics and social networks in education.
Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting to hear her describe the value of online learning, and in particular as a faculty member feeling like the connection you make with students is so significant and so powerful, but their courses are 13 to 15 students.
Wow.
So I don't know how universal that is for what they offer and the like, but I heard a very strong message from them. Again, knowing University of Phoenix is a complicated story, that the power for them of online learning is actually quite small classes, which surprised me.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of a neutral place to finish.
Yeah.
Audrey, again, as always, thank you for the work you do every week. I have a question for you.
Yes.
How many stories do you read that don't make it into your blog post or news item? How do you find the time to cover so much? I track. This is what I do. I sort of track as I'm on Twitter and as I'm reading blog posts throughout the week. I sort of track on the stories that I think are important, and I store them all up in an Evernote document. And then usually Thursday, go through and sort of weigh and think about what's worth including in this roundup. And some of these stories, if I had more time, I'd love to, like the funding issue around Desire to Learn. Thinking about, is that worth writing a story about? Is it worth a larger deep dive on my part into? So, I spend a lot of time thinking about all of these things. Some of them become longer stories. Some of them just become snarky sentences. You talked in the online session that we did about the importance for you of being independent.
Yeah.
Of not caring that that such and such a company is making profit, and that that's getting doled out, and that part of your independence is your disinterest in actually participating in that kind of financial reward.
Right.
How are you long term going to sustain yourself doing this work if there is limited contribution from traditional sources?
I think that's a really good question, and it's actually something that I think about and try not to fret about too much all the time, in terms of if I think of Hack Education as sort of my education startup, how do I sustain this? I think the question for me is that I don't optimize my life around making money. I optimize my life around making change and being happy. And so I'm not sure if I have a sort of a fiscally sound, fiscally responsible answer to that. But I love what I do. So
that's at the micro level. At the macro level, I think it raises a really interesting question, which is there an aspect to the current internet environment where content is easily offered for free and oftentimes needs to be free?
Mm-hmm.
Does that put us in a very interesting place where some of the more important work will have difficulty getting funded?
Yeah, I think that the internet has certainly shown, certainly not just with writing, but with music, perhaps even more famously. So it's sort of changing how people help creative people make money. And I think that, I think that there's lots of challenges ahead. And for me, the important thing is to make my work available for free. And I don't know how. I don't know if, in looking at the things that I see funded in the education space, and movies that get made and albums that get recorded, I'm not sure that we necessarily recognize and reward the right thing.
So if this tour, the first month of this tour, produces enough interest for me to feel like it's not just a crazy idea, but there's something solid. You and I have talked about a Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah.
What about a Kickstarter campaign for Hack Education? Just to say you want to provide independent journalism on ed tech. And I'm going to tread carefully here, but EdSurge just announced some funding, some of which came from companies that they're covering.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't it be important to kind of define that it's valuable to get some funding for something like Hack Education where there isn't an agenda related to the companies that you're writing about?
Yeah, I have in my good old trusty list of Evernote notes. I have a note started of sort of how do I crowdfund Hack Education, because that would be an important way for me to do it, which is, I think the beauty of crowdfunding is that you turn it over to the community and you ask the community to help provide funding rather than go to traditional investment sources, rather than people that sort of hold all the monopoly money. You take the tax that that everyone around the board has to chip in on. But I don't know. I think I need to still figure out what the product is. Hack Education doesn't really feel like a product. It sort of still feels like it's sort of my thoughts and my research and my writing and my rants. It doesn't really feel like a product for me to ask to sell. I don't even know if that makes sense, but it's something I struggle with all the time.
So if you're listening, you care about what Audrey does, and you know something about crowdfunding, call her. And then she'll tell me, and we'll both benefit. Audrey, I appreciate you. Thanks so much for everything you're doing.
Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later.
Bye now.